Oh, I am finished with my third job of the evening. Now I got a bit of a drive back to town so I can get to the last job, and then I have to be up at my first job at 9, which means I need to be at the shop around 8 or a little after. I think tomorrow is morning and early afternoon, and then I'll have the evening free. Friday is going to be a bear, as I've said before. And as I've been working on this play-by-post through D&D Beyond, the environment that I chose for the campaign is the city-state of Tarantus. This is a supplement from Judges Guild from the early 80s or mid 80s, and you can probably still get this stuff. In fact, I know you can still get this stuff online, probably through drive-through RPG. I'm sure you can buy original versions of this stuff from Amazon and so on and so forth. Although I've seen some of those, and those things can get pretty pricey. You know, I'm just pointing out there's some disadvantages and some advantages to that sort of stuff. The supplements I've had for nearly 40 years. Maybe not quite 40 years, but pretty close. I know I bought them out of a box at Ivor's Dungeon in the 80s. Some circa 84, 85, somewhere in there. They'd already been moved down to the bottom shelf, which is, like I said, a bunch of storage boxes, more or less, that he kept open so you could look in and see the contents. These were items that he had a limited run on, or just had some extra laying around that just weren't selling, and they were fairly cheap, so I snatched onto them, being a young man with a low budget, because for some of you folks, minimum wage when I first started working was $3.35 an hour. And I'm sure there's a few of you guys that can top me on that one. But I am a proponent of a living working wage for people, because far too many people live off of these so-called minimum wage or subsistence level jobs than ought to. And that's because that's just the way our economy has grown. At least it did in the past. I can't speak for how it is working now, because I have mixed opinions on that too. But we're not here to talk about that. No, we're not. We're here to make a long drive back to town, keep an eye on a potentially slippery highway, and keep myself awake. So the city-state of Tarantus is a seaport. It is considered the third largest city in the known world. That's this setting for Judges Guild. At least that was my understanding. The book says roughly 25,000 people living in it, although the amount of people living in it compared to the map that they show, I question the number. Probably more like 5,000 or 6,000 people, and which then would make it not so much the third largest city. But from my perspective, from my game purposes, it is a big city. It's very vast. It's kind of not unlike a bit of a twisted medieval version of London, with a lot more going on. It is known for shipping and merchants and pirates and all kinds of other stuff. There's a lot of good material to be had, and character references and things like that. Of course, it was made for an older system, the original D&D stuff. So we're talking THAC-O, D6s, that kind of thing. And there's some base rules for adapting it to a D100 system, which is also, pretty good. The thing I liked about it is I could have picked the city-state of the Insular Overlord or the city-state of the World Emperor. Both of them are quite extensive. They each have a lot more stuff going on. They're much bigger and larger than Tarantus, but I don't know. Tyrannus to me feels like it has some more character to it. And I'd reviewed it some time ago for my YouTube channel, and I'd reread the material and looked at a lot of the shops and the storekeepers and the other things going on, and it lent itself to a multi-tiered game where we're dealing with a lot of intrigue and skullduggery, of course, combat and other treacherous things, yet it was not so large that it would be overly complicated to handle. The government itself is a bit vague, though there's just enough material background-wise to allow you to adapt it fairly well, to kit bash it. This is a term that I got from my other hobbies back in the day. We used to when you used to do things like model railroading, a kit bash is where you took bits and pieces of stuff from other models, perhaps stuff left over, and added to whatever it is you're trying to create and give yourself a unique. Thank you for whomever you were for joining me very, very briefly. I appreciate it. You may or may not have lost interest or went to bed because, I know that it's a long trip and I'm going to talk nonstop for a better part of an hour. Hopefully I can do a little better time heading home than I did coming down here. The wind blowing the other direction, so the other side was drifted over or blown over much worse than this side so far. There's the key word, so far. Although I also have to not only get back to town, but I have to traverse the city itself and come around from the other side to get to the place I want, which is on the west side of the city. And it is a big city. Not unlike Tyrannus, but not so much with character. So as we progress in the story, we started out in daytime, and your typical medieval / Renaissance era city with lots of buildings that are built close together or literally built on top of each other to some degree. Their walls are supporting each other. In some cases, maybe the one wall of one house makes up the wall of the next house kind of thing. And then you have these alleys and these pass-throughs and things that I use the term loosely as an alley because in reality it's more like I said, a private exit or entrance to another set of buildings. There might be a small courtyard or a cul-de-sac or something like this, and then you'll have offshoots where you can get deeper in. And it's broken up into about 9 quarters, which is another thing that kind of buggered me when I looked at the map compared to the information in the 2 booklets. In the City-State of Tyrannus is 2 sets of books, right? And I grant you, they're old school pen paper with staples in the center kind of stuff where, age deteriorates these things. But, compared to the amount of material that's in the 2 booklets and the way it's embellished in the bits and pieces of what's going on, it's a much bigger city than what's presented on the map, which I kind of found odd. And one of my players, Mr. Oddlot, has been scooping through Pinterest or whatever it is, Pinterest, looking for lots of free images that kind of fit the environments that we've been describing. The old buildings. In some places, the city is literally 1,000-odd years old. The city built on top of each other with more stuff built and tore down. There are 9 quarters, with one being the, quote, laborer's quarter, also known as the poor quarter, because it is the most run down, the most crowded, the most filthy of the city sections, with the nobility and the merchant quarter being the top 2, of course, next. And the palace technically is a entity unto itself, so it doesn't qualify as a quarter, but it has an attached government section that I've been calling the government quarter. So it's all, I guess, its own quarter, if you will, and which is odd because it's not a quarter of the city; it's just a section of 10 now. 10 slices of a city interconnected. Each one has its own purpose and serves different roles. And to get to one player, you go through another. So for Livy, or Lita had gone uptown, if you will, to the nobles' quarter. She basically traversed better part of half the city or better to get to the nobles' quarter. She had to go through 3 or 4 different gates and get each one a little bit more posh than the last one, or a little more well-to-do than the last one. And you're not going to have the quote laborers quarter or poor quarter adjacent to the nobles quarter in most cities. That's not to say it doesn't happen or it can't happen, or you can't have a much more cosmopolitan where you've got entire blocks that are this and all entire blocks that are that. That would just make things a little more, I don't know, a little less neat perhaps, but the city is anything but that. The city itself has taken on a character of its own. It's become, in a way, a character as well, because it has weather. It has very different looks to it from daytime versus nighttime. You know, at night we're talking. Most of these cities of that era would be poorly lit. The only places that anybody with any money maybe would have lanterns, and then the well-to-do sections or quarters would have street lamps that are tended by street lamp lighters. Some of the better places are going to have crystal lanterns and oil-based lighting systems versus candles, which would be the lower level of things of that nature. Either way, you're still going to have somebody whose job is to go about each night, each evening, and light everything and refill whatever needs refilled or replaced, and then go around the next morning as the sun comes up and turn them all off or blow them out. Unless, of course, you're letting them burn out, which, fire in a big city is always an issue and a problem and a threat, even in this kind of fantasy setting where people have arts and magic to help deal with such things. When we're talking huge amounts of people, the city's also extremely filthy. It's dirty. There's nothing neat about it. That's a common... I'm going to rephrase that. I don't want to say it's a common thing. But it's been my observation over the years, after when I watch other players or other GMs operate and describe the locations of urban environments. The big ones we're talking here, not the little towns and thorps and villages, but the large towns, small city kind of stuff, that they don't give a lot of detail. They leave the detail to the imagination to some degree, but I think that's a mistake. I think you need to give just a bit more color, but too many of them just are carbon copies of the next, and they all seem to be clean. They all seem to be well tended. Oh, you have the occasional ruin, or you have this, or you have that, but there's just this lacking grit to it. It's this lacking element of I don't know, character. Now, one of the things, on a personal note, when the wife and I started looking for a house, just like when I sold my mother's house, I kept getting people lowballing me. Oh, well, the house itself was in bad shape. And I said, yes, the house is in bad shape. It was not poorly maintained after my dad passed away, and that is a combination of faults of a lot of different things and people and situation. But the property itself has character. It has something about it that makes it stand out from all the other properties within many, many, many miles of it. And especially in the town. There were no other properties, there was 2, maybe 3 properties that had the same kind of character. The rolling hills and the little creek and the trees and the well-developed trees and the little orchard and the vineyard and all the other stuff that my father spent years cultivating and sticking in. That place had value, and it wasn't a personal thing. It was money value. I understood that there was somebody out there who would love the property for the sake of itself. And we had too many people come in with this idea that we're going to buy the place on the cheap and flip it. So many flippers out there today, right? So when I looked for my own home, I wanted something with character. We did turn down 2 different places because they were just, they were too closely jammed together with the neighbors. The yard was just an open lot with some grass in it. There was no flavor to it. It didn't have, I don't know. They were just missing something. And I'm 52, be 53 this year, people. I don't have enough life in me left to take a raw piece of property and give it character. I don't have that kind of money that I can expedite things. My father worked on that property for 50 years before he passed away. 50 years. well, not quite 50, but 40 odd years, 44 or something like that, 46. Anyway, he planted the trees in the orchard, and he planted the grapevines and the plants, the perennials, and he sectioned it off. And Mom had horses and goats and other bits and pieces of livestock here and there over the decades that added to the flavor of the place. And you don't do that in a day or two. So you want to give that atmosphere to your environment that your players are going to be in. I mean, I've seen some players do some really good environments when it comes to the dungeons. You go into the dungeons or the keeps or the Wizard's Tower, and they've gone all out. You know, they've gone to great lengths to give you that flavor of that place, to make it so it hits home. But then they fall short when it comes to the towns and cities because, we're not going to play here. We're just going to come through. And that's another mistake, in my opinion, for an experienced game master. Should have at least a handful of city-based campaigns. There are so many spells and feats that are in player's manual that's suited for this urban environment, and there's so many options for encounters that it doesn't always have to be lethal. It doesn't have to involve combat. There's so many, pitting your wits against other people, out smooching somebody, out smoozing them, manipulating the guy over here who's a known con artist. Well, we get the better of him, or the occasional thumping the thug in the back alley. Sure, but let's have those conversations, those dialogues. Let's have those social interactions that stretch the character, to help that character become a fuller person in the game world. And that's what one of the things that cities can give you. So the city-state of Trantis itself, like I said, it's this huge, old, worldly place full of extremely large amount of people and a very diverse population. It has people and exotic goods coming from all corners of the Great Sea, which is yet to be named in our game because it's not pertinent to the story. And depending on where you're at, the Poor Quarter is this maze of small streets and interconnecting and winding and twisting and turning and small alleys and so on and so forth. That's because in those kinds of environment where land is premium, people are going to build and they're going to keep expanding. They're going to add additions. You see, I've seen stuff. I've watched things on various TV channels over the years, some on YouTube. I've read some books on this topic of medieval city and Renaissance cities before they had a lot of things like, hygiene issue, when they had working plumbing, when they really truly understand why people are croaking left and right, and the average person doesn't live to be 50. Now, I'm just saying, right? So when you add that dirt and grit, the city takes on a character. And in this case, it's a dark character. It's a hungry character. The city's indifferent and callous in some aspects towards some characters. And it's a loving, embracing its home to other characters. So when I look at Lita, who grew up and spent a big portion of her free time running around the Poor Quarter, she through her action of kindness and her healing abilities, she has ingrained herself to some degree with the population of the quarter. Well, not everybody knows who she is. They know of her, or somebody can help somebody else and say, you probably should go talk to little Lita, because she has the touch, she has the skill, blah blah blah. She helped so and so over here get better, right? And then you've got for her, navigating the back dark alleys on a foggy night doesn't hold the terrors or the trepidation that it would for a lot of others, because she knows where she's going. She's quite familiar with them. She knows the worst taverns and where the brothels are, where to avoid, what areas to kind of slide through, and who controls what section to some degree. Which thieves' guild or petty gang is in charge of that cul-de-sac or that courtyard or that portion of the street, etc. Enough so that she knows how to cope with it or to avoid confrontation, because that's her biggest strength. One of her several biggest strengths is this ability to so much blend in as become part of the scenery. She's protecting herself in that way, in a good way, right? And I think that's, and it adds, her reaction and actions to her environment add to the character of the city as well, right? It helps the city grow and become more immersive. And that's what's happening here. We've only been doing this for a couple weeks now, and yet we know so much about what's going on these, the local scale. To some degree, we're not overloading the characters. That's a mistake I learned long ago, not to pile on, right? That's the advantage of, I took advantage of using a pre-made city booklet, if you will, a pre-made campaign booklet, to give myself that space that I don't have to scramble to try to fill in the blanks or fill in the corners. It's known. Even though we don't talk about it, we don't bring it into the story itself. We don't really discuss it much amongst the players, but it's known that we're dealing with a very large, well-developed campaign city, and that there's a lot there, and at any moment's notice, we can add something or we can address something. If we need to go somewhere, do something, it's not that far of a stretch. It's not going to break anything, and to add something extra if need be. And then the characters, the plenty of NPCs. I've speckled through the encounters. There's a handful of NPCs that are straight out of the booklet itself, and then there's a couple that are not. The young guardsman Amlak is not in the book. Firehair, the Drow mercenary, is not in the book. These are characters I added because I have my own personal interest. I needed Amlak. I needed this character foil for Lita to some degree, and for helping propel parts of the story along. He's a key NPC to certain elements, and yet he's also possibly throwaway. So if a scenario presented itself where Amlak could die a terrible death or a heroic death or something of that nature that's valued to moving the story along, there's some impact here because a couple of the characters have gotten to know this young man a little bit anyway. Lita more than the rest because she's been in it the longest. And then we have the Mortonstaff. This Lord Mortonstaff, Basha Mortonstaff, or Martinstaff, came straight out of the book, and his House of Healing is listed in there. I just embellished it. I've made it much bigger, and I made it a bigger mystery. There's some kind of going on there, and the big mystery, one of the big portions of the mystery came straight out of the book, where it says when the patients check in, they're not allowed contact with the outside, their families or anybody outside the walls of the House of Healing until they're ready to leave. Once they're ready to leave, then they can go about and do whatever they're going to do. But while they're inside the walls, under the care of Lord Martinstaff and his whatever is going on in there, that immediately leapt into my mind when I first saw the location. I thought, "Ooh, this is a possible location for a lot of story. A lot of potential adventure could take place in and around this one location." And so the Black Rose has taken on a mysterious place within the story. We keep seeing the characters of Lita and Livy being drawn to this location. There's something going on here, and they want to know why, or they don't know why they're being drawn to it, and they can't help themselves, depending on the character. And even Rand started out at the city square across from the Black Rose, and he didn't know he was listening to Livy, the half-elf crier, giving out the daily news, but he did encounter Amlak the guard and the sergeant who's in charge of Amlak's patrol, and through them follows the man Hedera to the 8 Star, which leads him to, his brief encounters with Mordaci, which are now increasingly becoming more, frequent until we get the two characters together, and hopefully in a manner that they don't off each other. So, wouldn't that be an odd twist? So I'm introducing these characters in such a way that there's a potential conflict that might become lethal if the two of them step off on the wrong foot, and they're quite similar to each other in their mindset. in their thought process as characters. So it would not be unreasonable for them to have a showdown and one of them not to walk away from it, or either one of them. Wouldn't that be tragic to some? It'd be a twist. And that's all Game of Thrones. I mean, I've embraced that kind of mindset. I used to agonize over the possibility of a character death the longer the character gets developed and plays out. The same thing with certain NPCs. You get attached to them. Okay. Well, the city itself is an NPC on a grand scale. So we look at the city during the daytime. It's busy and bustling with lots of merchants, and the merchants, we know that there's a festival coming in 2 weeks, and there's lots of people getting ready for it, and this is a very big festival, and there's outlanders and outsiders coming in, but we also know that the king, and they don't call him a king, they call him Altar of the Lion, and his title's not king. It's some Mediterranean variant that I have not quite pinned down yet, because they don't ever address him as king, but they don't address him as Raj or Pasha or whatever. They just address him as Altar of the Lion. He's the head cheese, and his family's been in charge of Atlantis for 1,000-odd years, and we're there at the founding, etc., etc. So we know it's a very old city. We know that it has conflict with some of its neighboring city-states. The city-state of the World Overlord, for example, is its primary foe when it comes to combat. They've fought wars and in fairly recent times, and their shipping is, are always messing with each other's ships, or in some aspects their navies are having minor alterations and major conflicts that don't quite brew up, and that there's intrigue and skullduggery afoot, that the Altar of the Lion himself is paranoid about these agents and provocateurs and sabotagers and seditionists and so on and so forth that are flooding into his city, trying to usurp his position or weaken it enough that the agents can overthrow the government, and the overlord himself can take control and maybe build an actual kingdom, an empire from these two major metropolitan areas, which would then give him the ability to take on the world emperor head on. And these are all self-proclaimed titles, mind you. It's just the world emperor is calling himself this. He's in charge of the largest city-state in the known area, on the known, the continent. And Atlantis is number 3, and this is based off of their own stuff. So at night, it doesn't talk about the atmosphere. I've embellished, I've built up this atmosphere. I got it in my mind that I wanted this place to be dark and gritty. I wanted the stories to be mature and even adult as much as possible. I'm in a twisted way. I'm at an age where I embrace that. I don't want a childish game. I want a mature and adult game, and I want adult themes in this game. And if the players are good with that and they're okay with it, I'm pursue it. Because there's a real talent to being able to pull off some of the stuff that doesn't cross the line. You got to know when and where and how far to go. Not that I'm more concerned about not having D&D Beyond people upset that we've crossed some established code of conduct, and I know you can keep within that code of conduct and still do a lot of things. And Libby's one of those characters that she reeks of it. You almost want that to happen. It's like Lita. There is a quiet seduction in this character that it just screams to be tapped into somehow in some way, and it may very well go that route in time if the character survives and the player continues and everything and the moons all line up and somebody sacrifices a goat and whatever it takes. Now, we don't know. We have no idea where this could go. And with the city itself, it continues to expand and grow with new locations. And I have not added any locations that didn't come out of the book at this point. The little shop with the druid that runs it, the little healing shop that Lita works at, that's out of the book. So is the name of the druid, and his habit of going off to his grove outside the city on a semi-regular basis. And the houses of healing and the the marketplace, all these things are there. I'm just adding to them and utilizing them as they're intended to be utilized. Meanwhile, at night, the city takes on a completely even worse, more darker environment. So you don't see the filth and the sewers, the open sewers. You don't smell, you'd still smell everything, but you don't see just how bad the city is from that aspect. Well, that's in part because it's awful. Like I said, it's dark and it's poorly lit. Large sections are unlit at all because it's an expense. If you go into the poor quarter, it's rare to find a burning torch, because burning torches just invite fire. And then, and if you look at construction of medieval and Renaissance cities back in those days, entire streets became tunnels because the houses above would expand. The owners would build out over the street unless there was an ordinance by the city that prevent it. They would fill in the corners and the holes, and in some aspects build right into the street. Now, I imagine that at some point forced the city planners, the city people in charge, to maintain certain codes saying, look, you cannot block this street because it's a major thoroughfare, or it's a secondary thoroughfare, and it's also how we get supplies through, and more importantly, we can move men and material if there's a fire or something worse, right? And yet you see these overhangs, you see these old pictures of these medieval cities and towns where you get these upper levels that hang out over the street, and in some cases they're close enough that the occupants of the two houses from across from each other can sit there and have a conversation and be a few feet apart. In some cases even literally sharing an adjacent balcony or something like this. And I embrace that. And then the streets are covered in manure and waste and debris, and most of them are still, they're cobblestone streets, but in some cases they're in much disrepair. Potholes do occur in the better quarters. Of course, these things are maintained and kept up because of pressures from the nobility and the wealthy putting on the city, or going out of it and paying for it out of their own pockets. And then laying claim to the specific section of the town or the city that they themselves and their family is maintaining, because, hey, that's what we do here, because this is how things work in this kind of place. And then there's graft, and there's let's look at the character of the sergeant. I don't have a name for him, but the sergeant in charge of Amlach's little patrol. He's a vicious, in for himself, older, jaded individual. He flat out tells Amlach, when Amlach's trying to chat up Lita, just look, if you want her, just take her around back and have at her. Nobody's going to say nothing, because that's the environment they're in. We're the guard. What are they going to do? She's nobody. What is she going to do? That's not right, but that's how the mindset is. And when he finds out that Hedera, there's a reward for Hedera. Well, we know from Mordassi's story that the posted reward is 50 gold crowns, 50 gold pieces for the live turn. So you got to catch this guy and turn him in live, because the powers that be want to put it in the screws. They want to put him in the torture chambers and find out what he knows and who he is and what's he doing, because they suspect the worst of him, and probably rightly so. And yet, we know that the sergeant only knows that it's worth 25 gold, and he's willing to cut in his little patrol. So I imagine he's going to get 15 and the other two get 5 gold each. And that's still a nice payday for a city servant, if you think about it. Not to mention that we look at Mordassi's story, and he cuts a deal with Quig, the chief clerk of the sub-ministry of communications, who turns him on to this bounty before it hits the streets, before the bolo hit the street. Mord was already hunting down this guy. That's why he was in the right place at the right time when he came in, and was able to lay hands on him before everybody else. And did it in such a deft and creative way that you wanted to see how it played out. He didn't just run up and rough him up, grab him, and haul him away. He really worked hard at this, getting this guy and laying his hands on him, then getting him out of the place. And now he's wounded. Now he's doing his level best to keep him alive and get him to help so he can still cash in. And the 50 gold pieces, he made a mistake. The character made a realistic, reasonable mistake because he's a lower level character. He's not too savvy, and he jumped on the first offer, more or less the first offer that Queeg, or countered the first offer with Queeg and said, 30%. And Queeg's like, yeah. So it was obvious Queeg was ready to argue, expecting to get a much smaller cut. Now, Queeg would have been happy for, 20%. He had 10 out of 50 gold pieces is still a pretty good payday for a public servant who didn't have to go out and do anything. All he had to do is turn this guy on that he knows from the fighting pits. So, hey, he kind of messed up there, but he's still a bigger payday. So then when Stax comes along, the owner of the 8 Star, and has Firehair, the drow, cut in and made this dramatic situation where it seemed like Firehair and Stax goons were going to nab Hedera and take him away from Mordaci. Instead, she says she whispers to him, so the only two that hear about it's Hedera and Mord, that 60 there's 60 gold crowns here if you can get him to this boat at the down at the docks. So that led me to think, okay, so we have a seaport, and so far we have not gone to the docks. We don't see sailors or pirates wandering around, but they're there. The smell of the sea air is there. The offal from the big bay that's floating around out there is there. It adds to the character and the flavor of the city. And then I got thinking, geez, if it's in the right environment, it's kind of like a Mediterranean environment, because that was my thought process. So, we still got some cars up here causing a problem, or what? And blinkers up there weren't there when I come through. I hope they didn't shut the off-ramp off. That'd be a pain in the back. Go a different route to get to where I need to go. Anyway, it could be tow trucks. I don't know. I'll find out here real quick. So, Mordaci, or the city. So I sit there and I thought, okay, well, what if when it gets cooler, when the sun starts to set, these sea mists build up on the bay, and because of the way the city's located, they roll right in off the bay and right into the city itself, and they become this thick fog, this living entity unto itself that moves and meanders and gathers and dissipates and adds even more issues with seeing each other and noticing what's going on. So when I describe this environment, okay, yeah, this is what's going on. I think that one's. We have more in the ditch. This is a different group of people than when I came through. Now they're trying to dig themselves out. Spun out. Yeah. That was that off-ramp over there is real nasty. I hope that, there's yet another car in a ditch over there. None of those were there. The ones that were there when I came through here an hour and a half ago are gone, and now we've got 2 new ones in that ditch, and somebody's trying to dig it out. One of them out. Good luck with that, people. I hope the state county gets out here and puts some sand down. That's pretty gnarly, right? Just reminds you to be cautious and careful. It's taking me longer to do my job tonight, making this video run longer too, I guess. So, sorry about that. So now we got, like I said, the city's foggy, and in certain locations it seems like the fog pools up and don't move, becomes thick, almost as if it's cloying to you, sticking to you. And as you move through it, it moves with you. And then you get into the larger open spaces, the larger streets. It becomes a slowly moving wall or river of mist, and it's the mist in the larger streets. It's a little thinner because there's more airflow, but in the alleys, it's just you can't. In some places, you can't see more than few paces ahead of you. So if we go by, 10, 15 feet, 10 feet at the best, and in a closed environment where a lot of the alleys jink and twist and turn and come and, the way they meander the way they do, you have a lot of blind spaces, a lot of opportunities to be ambushed. So when the encounter with the thugs occurred, it just added to the confusion. We hear one thug runs away and he disappears into the fog, and he doesn't run maybe 20 paces, 20 feet, and he runs smack into another, until he flees from board and runs into land, and the land shoots him, and then he screams and doesn't quite croak, turns around and runs away and goes back the other way he came. And then, but at this point, Mordaci's he's more concerned about getting Hedera to help than he is about staying around and fighting another thug. So he takes off, and they go off on another route. So Alan follows the thug to the cul-de-sac, and he's about to follow the thug as the thug goes charging off down yet a different alley, and he brushes up against the wall and feels fresh blood, and he sees the carnage on the ground because he's finally close enough to see the bodies, and he gets the idea that maybe something, the half-orc has dispatched these individuals because the evidence is there. And then he goes and hears this not so distant noise, because I'm familiar with that kind of, fog can do that. That kind of noise can carry quite a ways in fog, and yet it can also be deadened and almost not carry at all. It's a very strange environment to deal with, and I've used this environment trope quite successfully a number of times over the years, and I think it's working well here too. And I've already had several of the players, Oddlot for sure, comment about how it has this Noir, N-O-I-R, however that's pronounced, feel to it. That there's almost like a Thieves World kind of look to it. Now, I'm familiar with the Thieves World books, but I never read them. I was stubborn. It was like the Wheel of Time or whatever. I didn't read those either, Terry Goodkind stuff, until years later. A buddy of mine was reading them. I was reading Forgotten Realms and Star Wars and BattleTech. He was reading this stuff, and he kept telling me, And back in the day, I used to get annoyed by people that was constantly trying to give me ideas about what I ought to read and what I shouldn't read. So, I just kind of rebelled against it a little bit. And many years later, I read through the entire Wheel of Time series. And once I got past that first book, because I tried to read the first book, and that first couple chapters did me in. I just couldn't get into it. It was some poor man's version of Lord of the Rings in my head. It wasn't until we got later into the book that things started getting interesting. Then when that what's-her-face showed up with her red leather armor and her funky baton and her really kind of, sassy, saucy attitude, then I got hooked a little bit more in it. Because, at the end of the day, I'm a bit of a perv. A lot of perv. I'm just being truthful and honest sometimes. And truth and honest is also always a bad thing. It is a bad thing in some situations. Perhaps so here, too. I don't know, and I don't care. I'm about to call this shut because we're going on in 40-odd minutes, not quite an hour. Looks like 43 minutes, I don't know. And I know I'm going to have to buy another card for my cell phone, add some more high-speed data to it. I'm sure probably burn through the 6 gigs that comes with my card. Thank you, Walmart. Starting to lose my voice a little bit too. It's scratchy. It's okay. So, can you make your city environment interesting? I think so. Can you improve on it? You betcha. Anybody ever going to listen to this stuff? I don't. Probably start to listen to it and then fall asleep. Well, all right, that's good enough. Let's see. Until next time, folks.